It's okay now? Yeah. All right. Good afternoon once again, and welcome to this session on new possibilities for measuring conflict-related deaths. This is a session organized by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations. My name is Mark Sebreros. I work with the Indicators and Data Unit of the UN Human Rights Office as a statistician. We work on SDG indicators. And one of the SDG indicators that we are working on is SDG indicator 16.1.2 on conflict-related deaths. So this afternoon, we are joined by a distinguished set of speakers who will be sharing their experiences, their expertise, and their insights in this exciting field of work. This session brings together different perspectives on the collection of data linked to the number of conflict-related deaths worldwide. So we will be looking at the challenges, including the dangerous circumstances under which this data is collected, the extent of its potential for accountability, and how it gives us a better understanding of the suffering in particular by civilians whenever there's a conflict. The panelists who are joining us today all work in different aspects of documentation and estimation of conflict-related deaths, and their stories highlight how statistics and new data science methods are essential in these challenging circumstances. So we will be starting with by hearing from our first panelist, Mr. Guilherme Leonardo Dutra works as a statistician in our team in the Indicators and Data Unit of OHCHR, and he's based in Geneva, Switzerland. So he's the focal point for this SDG indicator. And Gil, are you online now? Thanks for joining us and for helping
Yes.
organize this panel. So Gil, my first question is, can you tell us more about the work you've been doing at OHCHR on measuring conflict-related deaths?
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much everyone who's joining us there in China and also online from all over the world. And thank you to our panelists who accepted the invitation from OHCHR to be here today and present the very interesting work they're doing on this. And I think it's the first thing I wanted to point out about this indicator, the 1612, which is conflict related deaths per 100,000 by sex, age, and cause of death, is that indeed a very joint effort. So today the panelists that are here are quite a, let's say, a representative sample of the different professionals that are working on it. Is not an indicator that you can say, well, it's one statistician collecting the data or it's one organization collecting data. Is indeed a very multi-stakeholder process that includes human rights advocates, human rights defenders, UN staff, statisticians, data scientists. And today you're going to see a little bit about the individual work and the different organizations working on this. So this SDG indicator 1612, it's one of the indicators on the custodianship of OHCHR. So yearly, OHCHR is making available data on the number of conflict-related deaths worldwide by sex, age, and cause. And at this point, OHCHR is reporting on 12 of the deadliest armed conflicts. And this is under constant expansion. We're always at OHCHR looking into different ways of expanding to new contexts and expanding using new methodologies. And we some Megan, who's gonna talk later, is gonna present some of these new methodologies that have been used in the case of Syria, and we're always looking how to make more available this data on conflict-related deaths for the reasons you mentioned, Mark, which is the importance for accountability and also for understanding the specific risks that civilians face in conflict settings, and how this shifts. So, for example, this year, we're reporting we finished. We're going to report now the data for the conflict related deaths. This year we saw more than a 50% increase compared to last year on conflict related deaths worldwide. So it's this data, and also the disaggregation in terms of sex, age, cause, and that allow us to understand where to better channel resources, where to understand where are the worst risks in terms of dangers, and how the dynamics of conflicts are changing yearly due to protracted conflicts having a reduction in the number of deaths, or a increase after a long time of low intensity conflicts, or new conflicts bring a need for a new perspective on how we can reduce violence worldwide, conflict related violence worldwide. And so as I mentioned, we are expanding a lot constantly. It's a work in progress. So we're very happy to receive also your questions or comments on this indicator, because it's a methodology that's always it's always under discussion. We have an approved methodology, and we have a starting point with the casualty recording work that the UNOHCR has been doing, uh, which follows a very rigorous methodology on how to document these casualties. But we're always looking to new ways and context-specific ways on how to improve the available data. For example, recently we're looking into how to measure indirect deaths, because at this point all we're measuring is direct deaths caused in the context of conflict. And we're also looking to new context, how new traditional statistical methods and data science methods can be used to make this data even better.
Thank you, Gil. I think the audience are interested to hear from you a short summary in a nutshell. What does this entail? You mentioned casualty recording, integration of different data sources. What kind of data do we need to produce this indicator?
Thank you, Mark. So currently, this indicator, most of the data comes from the casualty recording work of OHCHR, which is a work that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have human rights officers on the ground doing casualty recording as part of a broad human rights monitoring work, which means documenting deaths that occurred in conflict settings. So we have colleagues on the ground really going there and triangulating and identifying when they receive a report that there has been a casualty related to the conflict under the human rights documentation process. And of course, we have many partners on the ground who are working on this, civil society organizations who are working on this to make sure that this data is as comprehensive as possible. And so this is the core data. This is the starting point for the data for this indicator. But there's also a lot of additional work that's being done in terms of identifying new data sources for this, and how we can combine this traditional human rights monitoring data with new data sources and also new data methods. So, for example, we look into possibilities of carrying out surveys. There's also a discussion on using demographic methods for indirect deaths, for example, using excess mortality. So let's say that the possibilities are endless, because the challenges are also endless in collecting this data in these volatile settings, in these very complex settings, and in a topic that's very sensitive as well. So we always try to find the best combination of data sources to make sure the data is the most accurate as possible.
Thank you, Gil. So you mentioned earlier estimation of deaths in Syria, and we all know that this conflict has been going on for over 10 years now, and there's been a lot of reporting on this for a time. And last year was the 10th anniversary of the conflict, and OHCHR released data based on this indicator. Can you share more details about that?
Thank you for the question, Mark. So Syria is we have been doing work from OHCHR side. We have been doing work on Syria, both on the ground, monitoring even during the most complex moments of the conflict, and also statistical work for roughly the past decade. And in recent years, there has been the HRC, the Human Rights Council, mandated OHCHR to document and present the numbers on the conflict, on the civilian casualties in Syria, and this led to a work on the estimation using a variety of methods. So, when getting this mandate from the Human Rights Council and this interest from the international community in really estimating the total number of conflict deaths in Syria in the period of 10 years of the conflict, the first question that came up was, well, how technically can this be done? What are the possible data sources? Where could OHCHR look into, or is the data that OHCHR has enough? And even though there's a very thorough work being done by OHCHR in documenting these casualties in Syria with the field colleagues, um, the conclusion was that it was important to look into other actors working on the ground, and it's a conflict that has many organizations working on its documentation, and also looking into new methods. So for this estimation that has been published last year and has been presented before the Human Rights Council, the OHCHR used 8 different sources, including sources from the UN, but engaged with the civil society organizations and work very closely on these partnerships with civil society organizations on the ground on making sure that their methodology was aligned with the casualty recording methodology from OHCHR. And our partner Fadel is going to be able to explain a little bit more about this work later, and how from the civil society perspective. And by this engagement between the methodology, education, and training section of OHCHR with this organization on the ground and getting all the available data sources that could get hold of, including from the ones provided by the government of Syria, it was possible to use a method called multiple system estimation to get a let's say the real number of killings in Syria, and also understand what's the level, the limits to documentation in this context, and what are the next steps for improving documentation and make sure that it's that the numbers that are being released are the best numbers possible. In terms of the methods, Megan, who's here from HRDAG, is going to explain a little bit more the complexities of the methods. That is it's a very interesting work, very saddening as well, because the results showed actually a very high number of undocumented deaths, highlighting even more how brutal has been the conflict in Syria to civilians. But it allows us to do many things that would be not possible without having these numbers, which is doing specific trend analysis, understanding really the moments of more violence and less violence, how different variables affect violence, and so it opens a lot of perspectives on how we can respond better to conflict situations, not only conflict situations in Syria, but conflict situations in the world in the future.
Thank you, Gil. And so we now turn to Megan, who will share with us more about this methodology that Gil had mentioned on multiple estimation systems. So Megan works with with an NGO, an organization called Human Rights Data Analysis Group. She's executive director of this organization, and their work revolves around the use of data to advance human rights issues. So, Megan, in relation to the work in Syria, could you share us more about the application of data science techniques to help us arrive at what Gil described, the best number possible of casualties linked to the conflict?
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to be in conversation with all of you. So the work that my team does at the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, or HRDAG, as we call ourselves, is in partnership with human rights advocates. So often with folks like the other ones on this panel with me. And so we work together to identify those questions about the trends and the dynamics of a conflict, questions of accountability that could be addressed, at least in part, through some kind of data collection and data analysis. And so we partner with those other organizations to help them think through if they have access to data or if they want to collect data, and then everything from processing and organizing to make the most sense of that information, all the way through to then those statistical models and estimation to account for things like missing data. And that tends to be the theme of a lot of our work, is in thinking really hard about what is the information that we had access to or that we were able to collect or document in some way, and what are we missing? And when we talk about and worry about missing data, I want to be very clear that that is in no way a criticism of the tremendous work being done by the documentation groups collecting this information. It's an acknowledgement of how difficult and dangerous this work can be. And I think it's the role of statisticians to use the correct analytical tools to make the most of what has been collected and documented appropriately, and to fill in those gaps where it really isn't possible or may not be safe to collect certain kinds of information.
Yes, exactly, Megan. No, so your group's role is to basically reinforce the data collection that's been done by NGOs and other organizations, and as you said, make the most out of such limited but precious resource. So in Syria, we have here Fadel, who's one of those data collectors that helped put together the data set for Syria. But before we go to Fadel, could you share a bit more, Megan, on the technique or techniques that you used to integrate data from various sources to estimate the missing number? And if you can also share with us the findings that you got from this methodology.
Yes. So we use a group of methods called multiple systems estimation, or MSE. And the way that works is very similar to what you already described. There are these multiple sources, as Gil mentioned, that are all collecting names of victims who have been killed in this conflict. And so the first step in the work is to integrate all of those different lists of names and identify individual victims who have been recorded only one time, individual victims who have been recorded multiple times across multiple sources, and combine that into a single list that has that information about what sources recorded which pieces of information. And then it's that structure that goes into these statistical models that essentially use what we think of as documentation patterns, those patterns of which sources have recorded which information, to then extrapolate to how many total victims must exist, even if we weren't necessarily able to name and identify all of those victims. And so that is a very brief description of the method itself. But if I could just mention the intuition behind how MSE works, we usually explain using an analogy. So if you'll bear with me, if you imagine a hallway with two rooms and they're both dark, and you don't know the size of the room, but that's what you're trying to estimate. And the size of the room in this analogy is the total number of victims. And what you have to learn about the rooms are these very special balls that when you throw them into the room, they bounce into each other and make a specific sound. And they don't make that sound when they touch the walls or the floor, only when they touch each other. And so you walk into the first room and you can't see how big it is, and you throw some balls into the room and you only hear a couple of clicks. And then you go to the next room and you throw the same number of balls and you hear click, 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 click. All the balls are bouncing into each other. So you would have some intuition that the second room must be smaller because all of the balls bounced off of each other more frequently than the first room, which must be bigger. And so to carry the analogy, this is the same intuition when we have lists of victims. If we see a lot of overlap, if the same victim is being reported by many of the sources that we're working with, then we think the total number of victims is probably very similar to the number we've been able to document. Whereas if there's quite a bit of difference between the different sources, if they're each capturing different pieces of the conflict, then our intuition tells us that there must also be parts of the conflict that none of the sources are documenting and that we don't know about yet. And so that, in essence, is what the statistical models make possible, is to learn about and to bound how much we know from our documentation and how much must still be out there that we haven't been able to learn about yet.
Excellent. Thanks for explaining such a complex methodology in a powerful but simple analogy. And of course, the raw material for this estimation techniques are data collected by casualty recorders. So without this critical step of organizations listing down whatever information they can collect regarding a particular victim or victims, we would not have been able to do this kind of work. So we are fortunate to have Fadel Abdul Ghani, who works with an organization called the Syrian Network for Human Rights, or SNHR. So he's the director of SNHR, and they are one of 8 organizations that have contributed data to estimate the number of deaths in the Syrian conflict. So Fadel, welcome to the panel, and we'd like to hear from you. What are the challenges that you faced? I imagine, I mean, we all know, we hear about the conflict in Syria, how horrible the situation was. But for people like you collecting data on the ground in this conflict, would you able to share us some of the experiences on the challenges that you faced?
Thank you so much for the organizers for this great efforts and for having me, for my colleagues at the panel. It's an honor to be with you. Syrian Network for Human Rights established since June 2011, and we are working on daily basis to collect and to document violations, including extrajudicial killing, including the casualties. So it was like more than a decade. We are working continuously on daily basis, and we are issuing a daily report. We are issuing a monthly report, and we are issuing biannual and annual report as well, and then a comprehensive report distributing the casualties based on perpetrator, based on weapons, based on a lot of factors. For sure, there is extraordinary challenges facing us, especially in Syria. Why is that? Syria contain not only one or two perpetrators. We are talking about more than 6 main perpetrators. First of all, there was only the Syrian regime or the government, that doesn't exist more than 6 or 7 months. Then the uprising transfer to be interior conflict. Then another perpetrator engage in killing civilians as well. So that actually create a huge pressure on us, because our work to holding the responsibility of this killing and try as possible as we can to recognize who committed those killing. Somehow it's obvious. For example, no one used barrel bomb from helicopter dropping barrel bombs. Uh, uh, the only one is using barrel bomb is the Syrian regime. Who's using cluster munition also is obvious. There is only two perpetrator using cluster munitions in Syria. So here we can identify that the Russian forces or the Syrian regime. But for example, when we are talking about mutual shelling taking place against area, so it's very difficult to recognize who has committed this shelling, especially if there is a mutual operation that happened in Eastern Ghouta, for example, which is getting rights from both at the same time, the Syrian regime and his allies, the Iranian and the Russian as well. So this is create a huge pressure. In some cases, we are unable to identify who is the perpetrator. In the cases of landmine or the cases of the explosions, in some explosions, it's a high tech to figure out who's the responsible. Holding the responsibility, this is the right of victims to know who's committed those, and it's linked to accountability as well. What is actually the other additional? It's very hard to work on the ground in Syria. We have team on the ground, but all in hidden identity, because as we mentioned, we are documenting all perpetrator. So all of them actually they don't like our work. We are not welcome to be or to reveal our identity. And security measures in our organization is top priority, more than even recording cases. This is the very tough challenges. The third one is after years of conflict, there is hopeless from the families and from the victims. You mentioned, Mark, that without organization, without local organization, because this is our home and this is our country, so we are working on daily basis. Maybe the international organization taking a case, but SNHR building database. This is for Syria history. This for us. This for victims. This for transitional justice. Without cooperation with families, if they lost hope, the victims, we are unable to do the work because we need primary source. This is our methodology actually. We need to talk to the victims or survivals or victims relative in order to record the names, the date, the incident. So we are actually relying on multiple factors here, including photos, videos. For sure, there is some cases we have more information about it than the other cases. There is also other challenges that the authorities or those parties, including the Syrian government or the Syrian regime, they didn't register those who's been killed, the extrajudicial killing, in the civil registry. They didn't register almost none of them. The vast majority is not registered or announced. There is no data actually. And what they shared with the High Commissioner is about 2,500 only. And if we move to the civil registry, there is no registration. On contrary, they issued on August 10, 2020, the Ministry of Justice, between two brackets, issued a circulate number 22, actually requesting from the family to come and to register their dead relative in the civil registry. And that actually crazy. The regime didn't recognize who's killed or who's being killed by other perpetrator as well. So there is no registration. And also the other parties as well, the opposition government didn't announce who's or registered or announce that, so we can make cross-checking. For sure, I will not talk about the extremist group like Al-Nusra or ISIS. Those are careless about such issue, but that also one of the main challenges. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Fadel. And my last question to you is, what kind of support do you need from the UN, from other stakeholders, in order to continue this very important work? And also linked to the point that you mentioned about the need for a mechanism to register these deaths and to be able to trace what happened to many of the victims of this conflict.
Actually, we this the UN work, the High Commissioner especially, and announcing and like back now recording what's going on in Syria. Actually, that's giving a message to the families that they are not forgotten, and there is who is documenting and announcing their suffering, and that actually a key message. And we try, if you notice that, Mark, as possible as we can to circulate the UN report, to translate it to Arabic as well, and to circulate it in the local media, because we don't want the Syrian to lose the hope, the family as well. So we need from the UN to keep reminding if there is like a major massacres took place, the High Commissioner need to step in and issue a statement condemning these massacres. So to keep following the major issues. I know that Syria now long decade, but if there is like, I'm not talking about maybe, and killing in Syria became, for sure, it's the worst in the world. The scale of killing in Syria, even it's been reduced past 2 years, but still it's the highest. Actually, the UN need to keep reminding the world that this conflict is not ended, and the highest crime is still committed, which is the extrajudicial killing, especially against the civilians. The UN also before tried to held a coordination meeting with those who's working the Syrian organization. So it became similar to, I can so-called platform to make those organizations coordinate in between each other and enhance maybe sharing information to so facilitate that. UN also need to share some tools. The organization somehow unable to get it, and to support those who's working on the ground. This is a very, I can say, harsh work physically, and for the team. The team need to feel a credit for what they are doing, and for sure those inside Syria, which is the vast majorities of our team inside Syria, they need to feel that there is acknowledgement about their work. So it's worth to have this credit, or even a thankful letter, or appreciating, or whatever. I'm always trying to get this for my team and to share it with them, not for public, but for them actually, to encourage them to continue this work. I think the UN can do all of that, and this will send, I think, a positive message to continue this hard work until the end of this conflict. I don't know where, but what is in the horizon, that there is no close solution. So we need to continue for the sake of the victims, for the sake of our country, and for the sake of those who's losing their lovers. If SNHR and maybe few remaining organizations stop the work, we will lose a tremendous amount, and those lot of killings civilians will be forgotten. There will be no record for those, and that's what we are trying to perceive. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for such a strong call to action. And we now turn to an equally harrowing conflict that's happening now in Ukraine. The conflict that started last year has resulted in many civilian deaths, but it also goes back to 2014. Matilda Bogner heads the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine since 2014. Previously, she worked on human rights and transitional justice issues in Libya, and also previously served as senior human rights advisor in Belarus. And now, Matilda, thanks for joining us in this session in the World Data Forum. Could you share a bit more about the work you're doing in Ukraine, your team is doing in Ukraine, in terms of casualty recording? And how do you manage to do it in such a difficult and volatile conflict situation?
Yes, thank you. As you mentioned, we've been doing this since 2014. So when the large-scale war broke out in February last year, I think we were in a fairly good position to start monitoring quickly the civilian casualties in the country. The situation changed drastically, but our methods remained quite similar. We had networks of people across the country who we were able to contact, able to follow up with, and that put us in a good position to immediately start recording civilian casualties after February of last year. But there are a lot of difficulties. The numbers initially were so high, we were looking at more than 100 deaths a day and a lot more injuries per day. So we were just overwhelmed in the beginning, and this made it difficult. We didn't have the resources to follow that number of casualties on a daily basis. We also found that there were many parts of the country that we no longer had access to, areas of the country that before had been safe, we had access to, were under hostilities. We were not able to get to those areas, as well as areas that the Russians began to occupy within Ukraine. We then no longer had access to those areas, making it difficult to collect, in some cases, information. However, over time, we have been able to go back to those very intense periods and to continue to collect information, to continue to corroborate information. So the corroboration is not something that just happens today. We look at yesterday's casualties. We continue to look, and where we see that there are gaps, where there were areas, for example, in Mariupol, in Popasna, these areas which were under intense hostilities and where there was very little access, not only to us, but to everybody. And there was little media access as well, or social media. There was little connectivity with those places. So we continue to look back and to fill those gaps with information as time goes on. We also found that some interlocutors are willing to share information while others are not. And so sometimes we're able to collect information, other times it's much more challenging. If you take, for example, heads of villages, we often approach the local village head, and some of them are very willing to share information, to give all of the details, others are not. So this creates challenges as well as challenges with disaggregating information. We sometimes can get enough information to determine that somebody was killed, but determining their age, determining their sex, determining the the type of weapon that was used can be difficult at times. But as I said, we have a broad network. We talk to victims, we talk to witnesses, we approach local authorities, we approach hospitals, morgues, and so on, as well as public sources. Often our initial information comes from public sources, and then we have to follow up with those other sources to actually corroborate the deaths and the injuries.
Thank you, thank you. So, Matilda, what is the importance of this work in relation to the broader human rights monitoring work in Ukraine?
We see this work as incredibly important. We have been the only actor, at least only international actor, that has looked at civilian casualties since 2014 and until now. And we are the most widely quoted source for civilian casualties in Ukraine. We have issued, since the 24th of February last year, we've issued more than 138 daily, weekly, and monthly updates on civilian casualties, as well as an annual update, which looked back at the full year and looked at those trends and changes that have happened. I think the fact that there is this focus on it and that we are helping to bring a focus on it, and we are widely quoted, including in the media. We've been quoted in more than 630 times in international and local media, both here in Ukraine and in Russia. And this helps to bring attention to the issue, which helps to put pressure on the parties to the conflict to comply with international humanitarian law. We have come to the conclusion that the scale of civilian casualties, as well as the scale of damage to civilian objects and destruction to civilian objects, indicates that there have been serious violations of international humanitarian law. So the focus on it helps to bring that to the parties to the conflict and helps them to pay attention to complying to the law. We have seen a drastic reduction in civilian casualties. As I said, in March last year, we were at over 100 deaths of civilians per day. Now we're at around 5 to 6 deaths per day. It's still an unacceptable amount, but it is a significant reduction. And I think that our work highlighting those civilian casualties does help to advocate for such reductions. Our figures are publicly available. They're available for decision makers, whether they're political, whether they're military decision makers, and we hope that that helps to influence the decisions that they make. It's also very important for humanitarian actors. They use our information in their public documentation. They use it also in their own decision making. It's incredibly important for accountability processes and feeds into different accountability mechanisms. And it's also important for the victims. It's important for them to be recognized, as I think the last speaker was talking about. But it's also important for them in terms of their right to remedy and reparation, so that they can claim remedy and reparation into the future. Having had their situations documented helps with that.
Yes. So, indeed, there's many use of the data that's collected through casualty recording, and not just for SDG reporting purposes, but more importantly for reparations, as you said, for accountability, for influencing the actors in the conflict. So, thanks very much, Matilda, for sharing your experiences and insights from Ukraine. Now we turn to another actor now sitting in the room. So Raymond Rosuelo works as head of research and knowledge management at the Human Rights Commission of the Philippines. So they are a national human rights institution, one of the oldest and independent NHRIs in the Asia Pacific region. And in the Philippines, it's also one of those contexts where conflict has been recognized. And so SDG indicator 16.1.2 becomes pertinent. So Raymond, could you share with the audience the work that your NHRI is doing, your institution is doing, to implement this SDG indicator, which is anchored in casualty recording and an estimation of conflict-related deaths?
Thank you for this opportunity, Mark. Um, well, last 2021, we forged an agreement with our National Statistics Office, or the Philippines Statistics Authority, for under a memorandum of understanding wherein we will collaborate to help monitor SDG indicators. Um, and part of the process was us being made part of an intergovernmental body, wherein the National Human Rights Institution just will not serve just as an observer, but rather as a part of that body who can deliver, make suggestions regarding statistics that could be integrated into the Philippine statistical system. So we've worked with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with proposal for giving a methodology that could be acceptable to the Philippine Statistics Authority as well as to other stakeholders. We've we're moving towards a reclassification of the um, indicator from a tier 3 indicator, meaning there's no methodology and no regular data collection, into a much higher, yeah,
National.
yeah, at the national level. Yeah, so we're making a bit of a progress in that regard, in the sense that we've we're scheduled to have an endorsement later this year, for coming from our um, the National Statistics Board, so that this can later be integrated into the Philippine statistical system. So we're also capacitating our internal units, our regional offices, to help gather the data, vet the information, work with civil society actors in the process, so that we can gather more information, and that we're able to capture more or less the universe of data that is available with regard to this particular indicator.
Thanks. So if I understood correctly, the Human Rights Commission is the one that's integrating data from different sources, including its own data, and will then share the aggregate statistics with the statistics authority for dissemination. So my question is, why do you think this is important for an NHRI, for a human institution to do, in a context like in the Philippines, to collect, integrate, and disseminate data on civilian casualties in conflict?
Um, well, conflicts, of course, impact a lot of rights, no, civil and political, as well as economic and social and cultural rights. So that, and of course, these are rights that our institution, the Commission on Human Rights in the Philippines, is very particular in protecting. So it's a natural work that we as an NHRI should be doing. We also recognize that there's an opportunity now, with the wherein the National Statistics Office is more welcoming, no, in engaging the National Human Rights Institution for this opportunity to be one of the countries that can measure SDG 16. So we hope to make that contribution along with our local partners.
Thank you very much. And that's an opportunity for me also to invite everyone to another discussion tomorrow on these new types of partnerships between statistics agencies and human rights institutions. So that's tomorrow at 10:45 in room 2, where we'll be looking at the examples of the Philippines and Kenya more closely. So thanks very much, Raymond, for sharing the Philippine experience and plans. And I think we still have a few minutes for Q&A with the audience. So if you have a question or a comment, please raise your hand to be identified. You can address your questions and comments to all our panelists this afternoon. Yes, and so we have 5 minutes left. Anyone with a question or a comment, feedback? Namrata, is there any question in the chat? I think there's a question in Huva.
No, there haven't been.
Okay. There's a question in. So, Matilda, in terms of the future of casualty recording in Ukraine, aside from casualty recording itself, are you looking at the use of multiple systems estimation or other techniques in order to refine the data on civilian casualties?
We have been looking at doing possible estimates in areas that have been very difficult to collect full information, for example, in Mariupol. And we have been looking, for example, at collective graves where there are a lot of bodies buried, and then trying to determine how many bodies are there, and then to look at how many of those are civilians and how many are civilian casualties. So we try to look at these types of things to come up with estimates. We've been in a discussion regarding methodology on that, and so have not come up with final estimates at this stage. However, we do still prioritize actually verifying the individual casualties, and I think over time, this is what will lead to the most accurate understanding of the situation in the country. And now that we have more time, we can look back, we can fill in those gaps. But we obviously won't be able to get all of them, and that is where estimations can also be useful.
Thank you, Matilda. Megan, Fadel, any last words or recommendations in this area? Let's start with
Yes,
Fadel and then Megan. Yeah.
I okay, Megan, go first.
Sure. Well, I'll just say that I agree entirely with what Matilda was saying about the future of this work, and I think that to the extent that statistical tools can be used to estimate what can't be directly observed or to reinforce and expand on, I think these tools can be used in a variety of contexts. I've been working with Gil on casualty estimation in Syria, but our team has also partnered with the Truth Commission in Colombia, and we've worked with a wide variety of organizations. And so I think that there are a lot of different contexts where this work can continue, this kind of collaboration can continue.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Fadel?
Thank you. I want to highlight that this work also can determine the scale of the violation and can give us in-depth understanding about how is the conflict developed and and that can be also serve the rehabilitation and also compensation. We need to compensate based on the where is the neighborhood or the village, the priority, where is the vast majorities of loss, the destruction, the casualties took place. And also we need to that also serve the accountability based on who's committed those crime. As I mentioned before, we try to identify the individual in between the
Yeah.
perpetrator. That also essential, and this work can serve this purpose. We need to keep linking this with accountability. That is the
Th-
main issue here, and that is what is giving the family motivation to continue working with us.
Thank you very much, Fadel. So we don't have much time, so just quick parting shots from you, Raymond, and from Gil finally.
Well, this is an opportunity for the state and other actors, particularly in the Philippine context, to really show commitment with regard to human rights. So we're engaging other actors to um, become fully immersed in this process, because this will send a powerful signal to all other, perhaps not just in the Philippines, but all other states, that there is a proper way to measure this particular indicator, which is often controversial.
Thank you very much, Raymond. And Gil, back to you.
Thank you, Mark. Just I want to thank you again, all the panelists who are here. I hope the participants manage to see how really it is in practice a multi-stakeholder process. We work all together trying to get these numbers. So behind this concise indicator, there's a lot of work and a lot of dangerous work, challenging work, committed work. I shared on the chat for those who are online the report to the estimation on Syria, the MSC, which explains the methods. And from OHCHR side as well, we're always happy to hear from the statistical community, from the data community worldwide, on how we can improve the data for this indicator, how we can find more creative ways of increasing accountability in terms of violence in conflict settings. So we're always open to listen from you, and thank you again for joining us this afternoon, morning, night, all over the world.
And on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for being here in person, remotely, from wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for listening to this and taking part in this conversation. And a round of applause for our panelists.